Welcome to the Explainer, where we break down the big stories behind the headlines. So, we've got one trade deal, but two completely different stories. How is that even possible? Today, we're diving deep into the 2026 India-US trade agreement, a deal where, honestly, it feels like Washington and New Delhi are living in two separate realities. So, on February 2nd, 2026, the deal drops. From Washington, you hear these huge claims: zero tariffs, massive purchases, a total game changer for geopolitics. But then you look at New Delhi's response, and it's all about one much more modest number, an 18% tariff. This isn't just a small disagreement, it's a completely different narrative. So, what is actually going on here? To figure it out, we're going to peel this thing back layer by layer. First, we need to understand the crazy crisis that even led to this moment. Then we'll look at the cold, hard facts of the agreement that everyone agrees on. And finally, we'll deconstruct those big, splashy claims to find the real story. To really get this deal, you have to rewind the clock to the trade crisis of 2025. See, this agreement didn't just pop up out of nowhere. No, it was a reaction, born out of some really intense economic pressure that pushed both countries right to the edge.
Before 2025, things were, relatively stable, a standard 10% tariff. But then things just exploded. In April 2025, bam, a 25% tariff gets slapped on. And just 4 months after that, another 25% penalty gets piled on top, this time tied to India buying Russian oil. That brought the total to a crippling 50%.
And make no mistake, this 50% tariff was brutal. I mean, just look at it compared to regional competitors like China or Vietnam. It put Indian exporters at this massive, almost impossible disadvantage. The stakes here were absolutely enormous. We're talking about $86.5 billion worth of goods that India sent to the U.S. in fiscal year 2025. That's its single biggest market. And suddenly, all of it, the lifeblood of so many Indian industries, was at risk. And this wasn't just about money or balance sheets. It was about people. In the textile and apparel sector alone, an industry that employs 45 million Indians, more than 2 million jobs were on the line. The potential human cost was just staggering. So, with that crisis hanging over everything, let's cut through the spin. Let's look at what both sides have actually officially agreed to. What are the nuts and bolts of this new agreement? Okay, it really boils down to two main parts. First, that 25% penalty tariff connected to Russian oil, gone, completely eliminated. Second, that original 25% reciprocal tariff, it's not gone, but it is getting knocked down to 18%. Now, this is a pretty significant de-escalation. The tariff rate plummets from 50% all the way down to 18%. That's a 64% drop. It gave exporters immediate, desperately needed relief. But, and this is a really important but, it's not a return to the old 10% baseline. Things are still more expensive than they used to be.
All right, now for the juicy part. Let's turn to those huge pronouncements from the Trump administration. It's time to put them under the microscope and see how they actually stack up against the facts.
The biggest claim of all revolves around this jaw-dropping $500 billion shopping spree by India. This was presented as the absolute centerpiece of the deal, a historic victory for American businesses. But the context here is everything. That number, it looks an awful lot like a pre-existing goal, a target that was set way back in 2025 to maybe, hopefully, double trade by 2030. It's not a new, legally binding contract. And you'll notice Indian officials have been very, very quiet about confirming it. Next up is the claim that India agreed to completely turn off the tap on Russian oil. If that were true, it would be a massive geopolitical shift. But the data tells a slightly different story. You see, India's imports of Russian oil were already down by almost 40% in the months before the deal was even announced. This looks more like a strategic pivot that was already happening, not some brand new sudden commitment made at the negotiating table. And finally, we get to the most ambitious claim of all, that India agreed to slash its own tariffs on U.S. goods all the way to zero, basically throwing its doors wide open. Yeah, this one is, well, it's highly unlikely. India has always protected its agriculture sector. It's a non-negotiable red line to protect millions of its farmers. I mean, just a month before this deal, India managed to get its key farm products totally shielded in a huge trade agreement with the EU. The pattern is pretty clear.
So, if the deal isn't exactly what the headlines claim, what's the real story? Well, the answer isn't in commerce. It's in the deep strategic alliance that was growing between the two countries, even while the trade war was at its worst.
This whole situation is a fascinating two-track relationship. On one track, you've got all this commercial friction, arguments over tariffs, all that stuff. But at the exact same time, on a different track, the strategic defense partnership was getting stronger and stronger, all because of a shared goal: balancing China's growing power. And get this, in October 2025, right when the tariff crisis was at its absolute peak, both countries signed a historic 10-year defense framework. This wasn't just some small agreement. It was about co-producing advanced weapons. It was a huge signal that for both Washington and New Delhi, geopolitics was way more important than any commercial spat. So that brings us to the future. Now that we have a better idea of what this deal is and what it isn't, what does it actually mean for the long-term relationship between these two giants? The best way to think about this deal is not as a permanent peace treaty, but more like a fragile truce. It hasn't been formally ratified, there's no real way to settle disputes, and it's totally silent on key areas like pharmaceuticals and IT.
All of this creates a ton of uncertainty. Since it hasn't been ratified by the US Congress, the whole thing could be reversed by a future administration. And a lot of the thorny issues that started this whole mess in the first place, they're still just sitting there, completely unresolved.
Which leaves us with one final critical question. Is this deal a real new foundation for one of the most important strategic partnerships in the world? Or is it just a temporary pause in a trade war that could flare up again at any moment?